Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, my friends. It is a gloomy day here in suburban Chicago, and I'm out taking a walk in between bouts of grading. The semester's coursework has ended, and I'm now thoroughly mired in the process of evaluating all the coursework my students completed over the course of the last semester. It's a fun process, but time-consuming. And so I'm stretching my legs and recording a podcast for you all. Actually, I'm going to record two, as is often my wont on a Thursday, because I am going up to the library, and then I'm going to come home from the library and record an episode in each direction. Look out, here it comes. So I thought on my walk up, I was looking through and I realized I have been slacking. At the beginning of the year, I introduced a couple new kinds of segments. I introduced my monthly film roundup and my quarterly reading roundup. And I realized that I never did my reading roundup for Q3 of 2022. So I should have done it in October. As you remember, October was a kind of fractured month in terms of the podcast. And then I recorded barely any episodes in November, or the first half. So it's not surprising that I didn't finish that, but that means it's time to get to it now. So here we go. In quarter 3 of 2022, I read quite a few books. I tally how many books I read. Each book I read, I put on Goodreads. You can look me up there. I think I'm B Riley 929. If you just look up Brendan Riley Goodreads, I'm sure you'll find me. You know, there are a lot of Brendans Riley, but anyway. And I tally each book and I tag it with the year as part of my reading challenge for the year. And over the summer, I spent a little bit of time reading some comics. And each comic, I don't read each individual comic issue counts as a book, but each trade paperback counts as a book. And I read through a couple series, so I ended up getting quite a few books read that way. And I'm not going to talk about those, at least the ones that I was rereading, because I did have a period in summer where I was like, I want to read something that's like sort of comfort reading, something I've read before. And so as I'm talking about what I've read, I'm not going to talk about them, but I read all 9 volumes of Preacher, which is a comic by Garth Ennis it's a sort of satire about religion and, the amorality of gods or something. It's not super clear to me, but yeah, so I read that. And then I also read volumes 8, 9, and 10 of Sandman, which I had been reading slowly over the course of the last year or so, and I just wanted to finish it up, and I did. So that gets me, those were all the comics that I reread. The one other book that I reread, it's actually something I've been reading for a while, and I got to the halfway point, and this is Quicksilver. The Quicksilver is the first of the 6 volumes of the Baroque cycle. Neil Stephenson wrote this huge trilogy called the Baroque cycle of these 3 doorstopper books. And then when it was published in paperback, they realized a 12 to 1500 page hardcover book is not really practical as a paperback. And so they broke them into 6 paperbacks. And so even though I have the hardcovers, when I read the books, I read them as in the paperback form. I only read half of the first hardcover, because they're pretty long and it eats up a lot of time. So I'm probably going to start the other one. I think, reading one a year actually might be a nice way to progress through all 6. So the first book I read, I finished in June. This is Joy in the Morning, which is a Jeeves and Wooster novel from P.G. Wodehouse. P.G. Wodehouse is perhaps my favorite, or I finished it in July, excuse me, because this is quarter 3. Is perhaps my favorite wordsmith. He has a really delightful grasp on hilarious dialogue and funny idioms. His main character, Bertie Wooster, is this sort of foppish dandy who's kind of a dope, but generally good-hearted, even if selfish. And he's got this thoroughly competent manservant named Jeeves, who helps him out, but also gets him out of a lot of scrapes. And Joy in the Morning was one of the Jeeves and Wooster novels. In it, I don't remember exactly what happens. He gets himself into a scrape. He gets invited to visit somebody and accidentally ruins an engagement and then gets engaged himself and then has to get the first engagement back on so that he can get out of being engaged because he doesn't want to get married, and hijinks ensue. It was great. I will say both Joy in the Morning and the next book I'm going to talk about fit into this category of book where it's like it is the same as all the other books by this writer, or close enough to be the same, that it's fun to read one every now and again, but it's hard to find a lot of distinction between them because they're all very similar. So anyway, that was Joy in the Morning by P.G. Wodehouse. The next book I want to talk about is Triple Jeopardy. This is from Nero Wolfe. Excuse me, it's Rex Stout. Nero Wolfe is the detective. Triple Jeopardy is actually 3 novellas packaged as in a single book. And like as Joy in the Morning is to the typical P.G. Wodehouse Jeeves and Wooster novel, Triple Jeopardy is to the typical Nero Wolfe novel. If you haven't ever read a Nero Wolfe novel, they're a delightful journey into a particular time and place, although he progresses with the time. So it goes from like the 30s through the 70s, I think, in New York. And the main character is this rotund gourmand named Nero Wolfe, who doesn't like to go outside. He likes to stay in, and he has a very tight routine. He likes to spend time with his flowers, and when he solves mysteries, he usually does it from an armchair. The stories are all told by his assistant and confidant and main investigator, Archie Goodwin. Archie is, of course, has a perfect memory and pretty good with a gun and pretty good with his fists. And so the stories are all always told through him. He's a good wisecracking guy and pretty attractive, so all the ladies are after him. But Nero Wolfe is the genius. So these are, again, kind of all the same, but all delightful to read. So I guess I was in a sort of fun, light summer mood, and so I read some P.G. Wodehouse and some Nero Wolfe. All right, the next comic I want to talk about is a horror comic from Daniel Kraus. This is called The Autumnal. This is a single volume. I don't think it's the beginning of a longer series. I think it was a one-shot graphic novel. In it, a young woman returns to her town that she lived in when she was a child, which her mom had taken her away from very early. And she doesn't really remember the town very well. But then when she returns, she discovers the town has a sinister secret, and it is grotesque and horrifying and wonderful. The wonderful part is for the reader, not for the characters in the story. Part of what's interesting is it has the veneer of both suburban horror, because the town is pretty modern in a lot of ways, but also of the rural horror, something like Midsommar or The Wicker Man, or some of the P.G. Wodehouse stories like A Shadow over Innsmouth, where the people in the town are all in on something horrifying and the people who visit are in trouble. In The Autumnal particularly, it also has to do with the dying of the leaves in the fall and the horror of the creepy woods. The art in this comic was fantastic and the story is solid. I don't remember being particularly blown away by the dialogue or finding myself wanting to share a page with anybody as I was reading it, but really compelling and definitely worth a look if that's your kind of thing. That's The Autumnal, graphic novel from Daniel Kraus. Next up is definitely the highlight of quarter 3, and maybe the highlight of the year. Like if I'm going to point back to a book from the year, if I had to pick one book that I'd say this is the best book I read this year, a top contender for sure is The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. Now, and if you're paying attention at all to sci-fi and fantasy, you've heard the name N.K. Jemisin. She is a prominent author who has won, I think she won the Hugo 3 times in a row or something for her sci-fi series. I'm reading the fantasy series, which she wrote before that. And I first heard about it at a conference where somebody was talking about the way that the techniques that she used to create the world of the comic, of the novel, worked to foreground and upend the north-south divisions and the racist implications that are so common in Eurocentric fantasy titles. The premise of The 100,000 Kingdoms, which is really interesting, is that there is a genetic line that rules this world, and all the kingdoms in it are subject to these rulers, in part because there are a handful of gods that are extant and are controlled by this family, or this family is in the favor of these gods or something. They don't really make it clear at the beginning. That if you go up against these families, like literally, they can destroy your whole civilization. And so the whole world is subject to the whims of this ruling family. And our main character is a princess in one of the small rural kingdoms in the world, and did not know it, but her mother was actually like the child or the nephew or something of the current king. So her mother was, before she sort of abandoned her family heritage, one of the biggest of bigwigs. And her mother had died, but now she is summoned to the capital, where she is named as one of the potential heirs to the throne. And then so you have this sort of character who is a proud warrior, leader of her people, but also a country bumpkin in a lot of ways, and has been thrown into the high politics and high fashion and high society of the capital. And that's just like the first third of the book. And then it gets more wild from there. This is the first of a trilogy, and I'm really excited to read the other books in the trilogy. I think I might do one of them a year as well. It feels like a good pace. We'll see. If the second one's super compelling, I might just read the third one, because the second one was super compelling. Although I did find the first one really compelling also, but really intense. So that's why I did not read the next one right away. There's a bit more romance in the 100,000 Kingdoms than I generally like in my novels, but that's okay. I can read stuff that isn't exactly what I would choose. But yeah, so generally, really good book, The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. If you get a chance to check it out, I recommend. All right, two more novels to talk about. If The 100,000 Kingdoms was the high point of my reading in quarter three, these next two are competing to be the low point. And for different reasons, I would say. The first novel is one that I read toward the end of September. And this is called The Lost Symbol. This was the third novel in the Dan Brown series, starring the character played by Tom Hanks. The third novel, Robert Langdon is the character. And it is just like the other ones. It is a potboiler mystery involving secret societies and ancient mysteries, the supposed secrets that undergird all of society, as understood by our main character, who is a sort of symbol specialist, expert dude. And at the same time, a second plot line that involves a parallel story, equal drama, and the two will become intertwined by the end. Dan Brown is very good at writing bite-sized chapters of like 4 to 5 pages, and at the end of the chapter, something happens that is a dramatic hook, and you turn the page, and now you're on the other storyline. And then you get to the end of that chapter, which is again 4 to 5 pages, and there's a dramatic hook. And then you're back to the first storyline, where you find out something that happened that resolves the dramatic hook. There are several points in these books where the dramatic hook feels like something from a 1950s serial, and the car goes off the cliff, and then you end, and then you get to the beginning of the one after that, and it's like, and it landed on ledge just past the edge of the cliff. Thank goodness it didn't fall to the ground, right? Like something sort of like that. I remember liking these books quite a bit when the Da Vinci Code came out. I read both of those, plus he had 2 other books that he wrote that weren't Robert Langdon stories, and I read those as well and thought those were pretty amusing. Either my taste has grown or I grow tired of the same kind of thing. I was much less enamored of The Lost Symbol than I was of the previous Robert Langdon books, or even the previous Dan Brown books. It was fine. If it is your thing, I imagine there are people who read one Rex Stout novel and think, wow, this is great. And then they read another one like, oh, it's the same thing. My guess is if you feel about Dan Brown the way I felt about Rex Stout, then you'll like The Lost Symbol just fine. The last book I want to talk about, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but my wife and I took a trip up to Saugatuck in Michigan for a short weekend away. We are actually there on Columbus Day weekend, which are Indigenous Peoples Day weekend. And while we were there, we went into a bookstore and they had copies of a series of mystery novels written by a local author and self-published. Now, I'm not one to be a snob, but these were not good. I only read one of them. I bought The Great Saugatuck Murder Mystery. I did not write down the author's name, my apologies. You can go to my Goodreads if you want to see it. But this was not a good book. The mystery was trite, the characters were wooden, and there were tons of typos everywhere. Like dramatic typos, dramatic shifts in area that made it seem like they forgot to put in a paragraph, like forgot to put in a section break or forgot to put in a chapter break. A real bummer. I did read to the end because I wanted to find out how the mystery was supposed to be resolved, and it did resolve, but ultimately it was not my cup of tea. And if my wife and I take another trip out that way, I don't see myself buying the next one in the series. So that's The Great Saugatuck Murder Mystery. Well, that's what I read in Q3 of 2022. What did you read? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and join the conversation there. Let me know what you've been reading. Share the link to your Goodreads feed, perhaps, and I'll do the same. I want to say thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.